Hello and welcome everyone to our final Pints Podcasts of 2020. It's kind of hard to believe that we're already wrapping up the year, but here we are. Thank you for joining me tonight. I'm really excited about the episode that we're going to be covering tonight. It brings up a lot of challenging topics, but also some very important topics that are super timely for what our community has been dealing with and addressing this year. So I'm really glad that if you're listening, you took the time to join me to discuss this podcast, and hopefully you had some time to listen to it as well. But before we get started with all of that discussion, we're going to go through some housekeeping items. So first thing you should know is that there's a delay in the stream. So I will be talking on my end a little bit before you guys will hear it. So there could be some delay between the time you're asking questions or putting in comments to the time that I address them on my time. So there's a slight delay. All right, other thing is submit your questions and thoughts in the comments. We love hearing from you. It's how we keep these discussions fun and interesting and not so one-sided of me talking at you. We love getting your feedback and input during these discussions. And then something else that I wanted to share before we dive in is just to remind you that if you're interested in joining the YNPN board, our applications for the 2021 term are now open and they're due on November 22nd. So we'll, I think, put the link in the comments. So take a look there, and you can also find it on our website and on our Facebook page. So plenty of places to find the link if you're interested in joining. And we have a few different types of positions available. So take a look at that, see if there are any positions you're interested in, but it's a great way to get some experience with a specific area in nonprofits, or and also make great connections in the community. And people who are involved in YNPN really look out for each other and share opportunities with one another and provide lots of development opportunities as well. So I highly recommend checking that out. All right, next up is about me. So I'm Erin, and hopefully you've seen me before on these live stream podcast discussions. But so I'm Erin, and I'm the program manager for the Down Syndrome Foundation of Florida, which is a very small nonprofit here in Orlando, but we do serve the state of Florida. And I've been working in the nonprofit industry since 2014. I started at Feeding Children Everywhere, mostly working in operations there, and then moved to the Boys and Girls Clubs of Central Florida for a little while, working with their development team in database management. And then I've been at the foundation for the last 2 years, so as their program manager. So I've done a few different things within the nonprofit world, and I've gotten some really great experience. And then personal stuff is I have an amazing husband named Mesh. And we have not driven each other crazy yet through this pandemic, so that's a sign we picked a good match for each other. We've been married for 4 years, and we met playing Ultimate Frisbee at UCF. We both played for our respective teams, and we have 2 cats at home, so that's me. And for today, I'm going to give a little overview of the podcast, and then I'll kind of do a deeper dive into some of the deeper points that they go through in the podcast. And then lastly, we'll do our discussion questions. So the title of the podcast in general is called Nonprofits Are Messy with Joan Gary. And after listening to this podcast, I actually explored a couple of her other episodes, and I highly recommend you do the same. I think anyone who's in the nonprofit industry has a lot to benefit from listening to someone who's really experienced working with a variety of nonprofits and addressing some concerns that I had, and I didn't know that there were resources out there like this for me, someone who works in the nonprofit world, to listen to. So I highly recommend it. And her episodes are free. They're online. They're on Spotify, anywhere you get podcasts. And then the specific episode is called What If Fundraising De-Emphasized the Donor? And there were a couple of guests, Vu Lei and Michelle Murray. And this episode was very thought-provoking and challenging, but also very inspiring. And I hope it will leave you feeling inspired to act when we're finished with our discussion, and maybe you already feel that way if you listen to the episode. So I'll just kind of give an overview of the episode to start, and then we'll dive a little bit deeper. So here is what the episode description is. There are those who believe that the donor-centric fundraising model may be perpetuating the very inequity we seek to address in the nonprofit sector. One such person is Vu Le. He's a writer, speaker, and former executive director of Rainier Valley Corps, a nonprofit in Seattle that promotes social justice. He believes there's a better way: community-centric fundraising. Vu is joined on today's podcast by Michelle Shireen Murray, a strategic advisor and consulting coach who co-chairs the Council for Community-Centric Fundraising, a movement founded on the belief that fundraising should be first and foremost grounded in race, equity, and social justice. This podcast will challenge you to examine and think deeply about your relationship with donors, and will define and elaborate on the principles of community-centric fundraising. So already, just the description is very thought-provoking, and it really, like at the end of the episode, it really shifted my way of thinking about fundraising in general. And I feel like it's such an apt time to have this discussion. So now we're going to go into a little bit deeper of a talk. So first, we're going to talk about what exactly the difference between donor-centric fundraising is and community-centric fundraising. So the donor-centric fundraising fulfills donor-centric requirements. That's the first thing to note. So they gave an example of ducks in a pond. So in donor-centric fundraising, the donors are like people who feed the ducks. They feed the ducks and they feel good about it. They gave them a little bread and they walk away. But what community-centric fundraising, how it looks at this analogy of the ducks, is that we're all ducks together in the same pond, and some ducks got more bread and they should share their bread with the other ducks. So basically, we're all in the same community, we're all in the same pond, and what affects one of us will affect others of us. So it's not this, we're two different creatures who have different communities. Like, we're all a part of the same community. And I think that's super important to understand as we look at the differences. So another thing to think about is that when we center donors, it's causing harm. We give them too much influence on the issues. And when that happens, our focus is taken away from the programming and the people who actually need help, and focusing it on our energies on donors. And, I think it is important to, keep the donors engaged, but when too much of the attention of the organization is going towards keeping donors engaged, maybe it's time to rethink what sort of fundraising model you're using. And also, when we center donors, it creates a savior complex. And I think we talked about this previously as well when we had a guest from Second Harvest Food Bank. And she kind of talked about how the difference between sympathetic and empathetic fundraising. And we'll actually talk about that a little later as well. But that was kind of their approach when they're telling stories, is like, we want donors or potential donors who are reading to empathize with the people that they're helping, not sympathize for them. So we don't want to create that savior complex. And then also a really challenging piece that I hope we all think about is that, there are, wealth inequities in this country and all around the world. And, it's hard, but it's really important to examine where that wealth came from. So if it is family wealth, where did that wealth originate from, and should it rightly be yours? So it's pretty challenging, but I think it's something that people are getting more comfortable talking about, and that we should be shifting to a more justice-minded sense of giving, whether that's paying more in taxes or or in donations that you're giving to nonprofits, is that, this is the just thing to do, which is a really revolutionary way about thinking about fundraising. So very interesting things and really important things. So Meg says, yes, the distribution of wealth. Yeah. And then also another piece of this donor-centric fundraising that is really negative for our community is that it perpetuates a nonprofit Hunger Games. So I've definitely felt this way before, where I was like, oh, I can't encourage my donor to give to this other organization because then they won't want to donate to me anymore. So, and I'm sure others have felt that way too, but I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but what they found was that it just led to the donor donating to more causes rather than like because they referred them to another organization, they stopped giving to theirs. So that's another thing to think about as well, is like, do we really all want to be competing for what we think is a scarcity of dollars that are out there? So, and then another point they bring up is that we are all a community, even if, our missions are not specifically related. We're all a global community. So our missions can't be siloed. There's intersectionality. Everything is interrelated. And then we also want to move from being centered on donors' feelings to being focused on existing injustices. So an example that was given in the podcast was, Vule, that was his name. So Vule, the guest speaker, or one of the guest speakers on the podcast, talked about his son who planted a seedling and said, "Look, Dad, I planted this beautiful seedling." And Vu was like, "Okay, that's great," and looked behind his kid and was like, "But you trampled all of the plants as you walked to plant your seedling." So it's a kind of an example that shows, there are unintended negative consequences, but you're looking for praise for this very small thing you did, which, like, yes, it is great, but like you're not looking at the other negative consequences of maybe some other things that you are doing in your life. So it's definitely taking a more holistic view of how donations are made, where wealth comes from. So again, very challenging, but also really important, and hopefully game-changing in the not too distant future with how nonprofits fundraise. All right, so and now we're going to talk a little bit more about how community-centric fundraising is different from this donor-centric fundraising. So in the donor-centric fundraising, there's this otherizing of recipients, and it damages the very communities that we as nonprofits are trying to serve. So it's kind of saying like, you, donor, you are helping this other group way over here. And it's really important to make our donors and our community understand that we're all in this thing together. So shifting from why should I care about this other organization to here's why you should care about this other organization. Cheyenne says, I've heard from several sources that donor giving is shifting because of differences in generational values. What do you think of that? I think that's really true. And I've definitely like experienced differences in thinking as far as like different volunteers that we have come in to help us fundraise, or that's the main example. Is like you can tell that some of the younger ones are more willing to partner with other organizations, and there is kind of this sense of like nonprofit Hunger Games of like, well, this other organization already works with them, so there's no way we would get donations from them, or we work with this group, so we shouldn't refer them to this other group. So yeah, Cheyenne, that's a really good point. All right, what else? Where was I? And then they go on to talk about how this movement to community-centric fundraising originated. So they said it was a blend of emotional and empirical studies. So kind of like what they were feeling as nonprofit leaders and professionals in the development world. And then they also took a survey of fundraisers of color to see how they were feeling. And they said that they found that the participants felt that they had no one to bounce ideas off of, no resources really to see how to go about changing fundraising. And then some resources that they shared about their website was that it's a support community, and this is something you guys can look into as well. This is a real thing that exists. So there's a support community, and then they generate knowledge and framework to challenge conventions with fundraising, and they also act as a lab. So they post lots of case studies, and they encourage others to post what they're doing, what's working. And then they also offer a podcast called Ethical Rainmaker. And I was looking at some of the episodes that they have, and I really want to check out some of them. One of them is called like Why White Women Are like Gatekeepers in Nonprofits. And it's so true that white women make up a huge component of nonprofits, and how that affects maybe minority communities or, that kind of thing. So I'm really interested in listening to that one. But yeah, so definitely some resources there that you can check out. And if you go to the link where the podcast is, you can see what that website is and what resources are available there. All right, so now how will we know that we've made an impact by shifting that mindset? So we have to shift from that what's best for our donors to what's best for our community. Donors are not typically involved in the day-to-day of our organization's clients. So they don't know what's best, but because they're giving the money, some donors, especially larger donors, expect to have a say in like how that money is spent, but they really don't have a full grasp of what will be most effective because they're not in the day-to-day piece. So we really need to shift from giving donors all of that power to advocating more for our clients and saying and telling our donors, no, this is how this money would be best used for us. So, and then they also talked about how it's, a fairly common practice for donors who want to get involved to like shadow someone at a nonprofit or, make visits to the place. But if you think about it, it's like, okay, now your programs people or even your development people now have to babysit a donor who has come in and very well-meaning wants to know more about what's going on at the nonprofit, but really is their time better spent showing this donor around in detail and in depth, or is it better spent with programming and serving clients? And then as a donor, so if you're looking to support nonprofits, so educate yourself, like figure out who's calling the shots at the organization. Is it the donors? Is it people who are working directly with clients? And then how are they making themselves accountable to the community that they serve? So those are important questions to ask and good information to find out before you donate to an organization. All right, and then as a development professional, how do you make a difference? So you have a lot of influence in the community, and instead of a tour, maybe this is what they suggested. So do a Zoom call with 10 different organizations who are addressing the same issue. And they said that the organizations who partook were scared that the piece of their pie would get smaller, but instead it got bigger because the donors were able to see how effective all of the organizations were. And it's just a really interesting and different way to approach keeping donors informed. So if you were to think about it, like maybe it's a feeding organization and you have 10 organizations with the mission to end hunger, that might be a little daunting at first. And, maybe you wouldn't want to share your time with a donor with these other organizations. But what they have found is that it just helps the donor understand like what different needs are being met in the community and how these organizations can work together in that more community-centric model. All right, and then this one is so important, but it says we're too protective of our donors. So we infantilize donors because we're afraid of their feelings being too fragile to handle the truth. So we need to stop underestimating them. That's kind of the bottom line with their point. So we have to build more authentic relationships by telling the truth. And they did give an example where, there was a more fragile board member who left the board, took their gift with them because they were not on board with the community-centric model of fundraising. However, many of them did stay and they understood the importance of switching to a community-centric model because it's more sustainable. If we're all constantly playing the nonprofit Hunger Games, that can't last forever. So it's important to be upfront with your donors, let them know how you want to approach it instead of being like, oh, good job. You did this thing. And they kind of gave the example of like writing this because of you thank you note every time your spouse did their chores. It's like, that would be really nice if you got a thank you note every time you did your chores from your spouse. But, it's kind of your duty and your responsibility to do those things. So you don't really deserve that thank you note. So that's another piece to switching from that donor-centric model. It's like not just giving this kind of empty praise for something that should be our duty as active community members. All right, and then another question that was asked to the podcast panel was, how do you go from donor-centric to community-centric support, or sorry, excuse me, how do you go from donor-centric to community-centric without losing short-term support? So what they said right off the bat and kind of reemphasized was that we've been underestimating donors, and generosity begets generosity. And you can create reciprocity with other organizations through referring donors to donate to another organization that works in the same space that you do. And they found that every time they did that, that organization would then send other donors back or invite, their organization to participate in a joint fundraiser. So again, the generosity begets generosity, and you can create reciprocity. That was a lot of osities. And then, someone also asked, how is a thank you different in a community-centric model? And this is one that really challenged me because I am a person who's all about thank you notes. But they said a handwritten thank you note as a way to thank donors is very white. And in many other cultures, like hosting someone for a meal or spending time with somebody, there's just like so many other ways that you can show your thanks to donors. And so this thank you note thing, they're kind of phasing it out or just doing it if it's the preferred way of thanking. But what they've done sometimes is like host a lunch for all their donors at once. So it's less time, and it's a way to like keep those donors engaged as well, and provide a networking opportunity for them. So it's just a different way, and kind of shifting from that default of doing a thank you note. And they also asked the question of, would you rather have your executive director spending all their time writing thank yous or doing the work needed to move your organization forward? And they also mentioned valuing time as equally as money as a way to shift away from that donor-centric model. So putting more value on volunteer hours and people who donate their time. And then next they were asked, how do we move donors to donating from a place of empathy instead of sympathy? And I'm really glad that this was brought up because, again, we talked about this at one of our previous programs. And I love this answer. It's so challenging, but when you think about it, it's so true. So they said that both empathy and sympathy are overrated. They both center the donor and their feelings, which I'd like to just sit with that for a little bit because it's very challenging when you think about traditional fundraising to think about, nope, we don't want the donors' empathy or sympathy. So now that you've let that sink in a little bit, so they want to move towards a sense of justice. So justice-based giving, which is pretty incredible. So the example they gave is if someone is killed because they're Black, it doesn't matter if you sympathize or empathize with that person, we still need to be supporting ending police violence because it's the just thing to do. So pretty powerful and a pretty good reason to switch from donor-centric to community-centric fundraising. And a real world example that they gave was the curb cut effect. So individuals who use wheelchairs fought to get edges of curbs cut so their wheelchairs could move on and off the curbs. And kind of the pushback that they received was, why should we spend so much money on this when it only affects a small population? And what they found was after they cut the curbs to allow wheelchairs to travel more smoothly was that everybody benefited. So it was easier for elderly people to use the sidewalks. It was easier for movers, parents with strollers. So there were these unintended positive effects from making this change to make environments more inclusive. So everybody benefits when we focus on people who are most affected by injustice. And I'm going to say that again because I really love it. And it's something I pulled directly from the podcast, which is everyone benefits when we focus on people who are most affected by injustice. Pretty amazing stuff. So I really love this podcast episode, if you couldn't tell. And I think that it's, again, so timely for us right now and everything we've been through in 2020 and even before 2020, but just things have been more on the forefront of conversations. And I think this is a really great time to revisit how we fundraise. So I want to also ask a few questions of you guys. and see what you think. I'll do my best to answer some of these if we're not getting responses in the chat, but I would love to hear what you guys think about these questions. So first and foremost, what do you think about community-centric fundraising? So I know this was a lot to take in, especially if you'd never heard of the concept before, but what do you think? Do you think this is a good way to go? Yeah, Meg, if you would like to jump in, go ahead.
Hello, friends out there in the nonprofit world. First of all, my name is Megan. I am the 2020 board chair of YNPN. I'm not going to do a whole spiel. I think the most important part of me is that I have 2 fur children, a little Yorkie named Dorian and a 60-pound pit named Lola. But the question is, what do you think about community-centric fundraising? And community-centric fundraising was also, Aaron, a similar adjustment mentally to me. And I think that is probably a byproduct of growing up in a predominantly white space where that taking care of each other in our community is not predominant unless you're speaking in terms of wealth and in terms of monetary value. So that shifting of wealth to support others is not something that I traditionally considered in a fundraising approach. And I think it's wide and vast, not something that's been traditionally considered in a fundraising approach in more well-known, larger nonprofit world. But community-centric models work. And I think 2020 is very clear evidence of that. And what power comes behind wealth distribution and the power that comes behind communities taking care of their communities. You mentioned a really powerful pull of words from the podcast, which was everyone benefits when we focus on people who are most affected by injustice. And I think that is a really great baseline for community-centric fundraising, is that when we take care of everyone in our community, when we take care of the people most affected and most put down by injustice, we inevitably are getting that reciprocal effect of taking care of ourselves as well. So I love this a lot. Cheyenne mentioned it's critical to getting to the root cause of community-based problems. If we can't work with the community to identify solutions, then problems will never truly be resolved. I think that's a really phenomenal point to bring up. I also think that a lot of our issues center around donor prioritization. So shifting to a community-centric fundraising model also shifts the really powerful importance that we need to make sure that the communities that our nonprofits in our sector here in Central Florida are supporting, making sure that those communities are at the tables making decisions as well. And sometimes you just can't do that with restricted funds. Sometimes you can't do that when you're busy making sure a donor feels valued and recognized for the contribution they make. When truly, I think that's just like placating the palate of someone to feel like they are intricately special for doing really what we should all have. I think our Western society is very individualistic. I might be going off on a tangent now, but we're really individualistic, but we do have a responsibility to take care of our communities. And I think that this is the kind of what Cheyenne mentioned, the root base to getting to that.
Yeah, I love that answer. It kind of was a great summary of everything. So, I froze for a second there. Yeah, I think that was a great summary to this entire podcast. And yeah, it really echoes like my feelings at the end of, after I listened to it, I was like, we all need to do this like right now.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a model. This model is new to like relatively new to like my world and other major nonprofit worlds. But this is what community-based organizations have been modeling for decades, centuries even. That sharing supportive community like wealth and distribution of resources. Like this is new in naming to certain people and certain groups. But the problem solving technique has been something that a lot of grassroots organizations have truly been screaming for forever.
Yep. I'm glad that it's getting more traction. I'm sad it's taken so long for people to start listening, but I'm glad that, people are starting to see the benefits of it and are starting to think in a more community-minded way.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Next question. What was the most challenging part of this talk for you? And for me, I'll go first this time. So some of these concepts were not exactly new to me, but bringing them into the nonprofit world was. So like centering justice, I thought about as being more like a political or personal priority. And I hadn't really thought about like nonprofits also have a responsibility to make that their priority as well, because even if it's not directly stated in a mission, it comes back to that injustices anywhere are having negative effects for the entire community. And so that was pretty not like challenging as far as like I need to like get on board with this, but just like I hadn't applied that thinking to nonprofits before. So I'm glad that, my vision has, stopped being quite as narrow as far as that goes. Mm-hmm. And then also as far as the thank yous go, like I said, like I've always been like very into like writing thank you notes and being like, this is how you thank someone. And so just like understanding that isn't normal for everybody. It's just normal for me. And there are tons of different ways that you can go about that.
Yeah, I definitely, I definitely can, that the sentiment that I resonate with that you said was the understanding that nonprofits should be internalizing these concepts like justice into their inner workings. And I've not necessarily put those words to it, but I've never attributed the same level of need across the board, probably until pretty recently, the past few years, of really internalizing that first and foremost, nonprofits exist because of gaps in our society that need to be addressed. And that gap is always inequity in some form or another. And inherently, there is no apolitical organization, or there shouldn't be, because what we are doing is directly affecting our community members, their lives, and their livelihoods. And the biggest challenge in this podcast to me was kind of conceptualizing the action component, specifically in like, how do we move donors from this place of where they're used to sitting down and being sold these sob stories and being told that they're like thoughtful and amazing for their inputs, and distributing their wealth, and that they're getting buildings named after them. And it's that part is the hardest part for me conceptually to not necessarily understand nor want, but to envision. Because how? We've built an entire nonprofit sector, largely, not completely, not all. Obviously, community-centric models and grassroots organizations are in existence and doing phenomenal things. But we've built largely a nonprofit that's structured around a donor and what the donor brings to the table and what the donor allows to be brought to the table. Gina mentioned there's a really great TED Talk that talks about stewardship and how nonprofit needs to rethink donors and how we fundraise. That's a TED Talk. I have not seen that. The way we think about charity is dead wrong is apparently the name of it. And I think that is well worth a dive into. Thank you, Gina, for sharing. I was waiting for Cheyenne's input. I was waiting for it. Because background for everyone, Cheyenne is our current vice chair, our incoming 2021 board chair, which is very exciting. But Cheyenne's training is in grassroots community fundraising community models. So I am very excited for her perspective. These topics are very familiar to me as well. Thankfully, I have organizational support behind me as I've made the decision to decline the support of a donor whose vision did not align with the community's goals. However, I know that it's not easy for everyone to be able to say no to funds or fundraisers. And yeah, I think that point is pretty integral to probably why we stick to this cycle. Shanna said, I think the book Toxic Charities also touched on toxic donors. It did. And we, throwing it back to way back book clubs, I think we did that book early last year or maybe 2 years ago as one of our, remember when we met in real life for book clubs? One of our non-virtual book clubs. But yeah, I feel that we've had a lot of nonprofits that function on like a get or die model. If they're not getting funds, they are not existing. And being on that level, in that brink, in that emergency, like red flag moment, sometimes you make decisions that keep permeating these toxic cycles.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's hard to feel like you're walking away from this with like, we got to change the whole system. And then it's like, all right, well, how do we start with that? And I think some things would be to just like have conversations with your nonprofits and say, like, one of the things they brought up was like, do you understand who makes the decisions about like programming or how you serve your clients and who makes those decisions? So I think that's an important thing to understand about your organization and kind of start there. And then talk, if you're not on a part of development in your organization, maybe talk with your development team and see how do you seek out donors and what's your approach. So maybe see if your nonprofit is already employing some of these methods. But I think the first thing almost always with these types of things is to have a conversation.
Yep. And I think that next question was, does your organization employ any fundraising was like right on the marker. Shana also mentioned, I wonder if there are programs out there that teach new nonprofits to fundraise in this type of model. If there are, that's actually, I'm going to write that down. I'm going to just copy and paste from your comment because I would love to find those resources. I think that learning about the concept of community-centric fundraising is phenomenal. And like you said, Erin, everything begins with a conversation. But to get back to my hang up that I had with the podcast was envisioning just like how do we shift? So I think finding those resources, actually, Cheyenne, is a really great point.
I think they mentioned in the podcast, I'm trying to find it, like that they have this website that they're putting materials together for and the case studies. And I think it's called Freedom Conspiracy, perhaps. I'm looking at the links that they have.
Okay. If you find it, throw it in the chat.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. I think we actually just like answered that question. What was the next one? Do you have any light bulb moments during the podcast? Did you have any?
We already kind of touched on it, which was just like folding in seeking out to end injustices into your nonprofit work. And even if your organization already has that as part of its mission, but to a very specific population, just understanding that all of those populations are interconnected. And as a community, what affects one of us affects all of us. So that was a big light bulb moment for me.
The podcast reminded me of one of my light bulb moments. I don't think I had any like like super big light bulb moments, I kind of just sat listening and agreeing and nodding my head the whole time. But the curb cuts example reminded me of a light bulb moment that I had when I was actually working for a organization structured around disability resources. And it was the disability community that fought for those curb cuts. And like you said, when you create inclusion into the baseline structure and foundation of occurrences in our society, you by default end up benefiting more than just the population that it was intended to serve. And that happens obviously vice versa as well, when you do things that are detrimental to society, with the idea of only punishing one group or population of people. And I think 2020 is evident on both ends of that spectrum. But it reminded me of that light bulb moment where when we inner work justice into the fabric of our organizations as our guiding model, no matter where our nonprofit falls, whether it's the museum sector, whether it's food and hunger, whether it's for those experiencing homelessness, those living with disabilities. When we focus on a justice-based community model, we are by and large bettering society as a whole and therefore benefiting us all. So I think that was like the rekindling of a light bulb moment during the podcast. Jesse asked, is what you're looking for community-centric fundraising.org? No, but that is actually a really great resource place to head to. I have not explored the insane wealth of knowledge that exists on their website, but I'm sure they probably have these resources. So thank you, Jesse, for throwing that into the chat. 10 out of 10, much appreciated. And then Erin pulled out actually VU, which is funny because we talked about VU last month in book club. Pulled out an article from VU's blog, which is Nonprofit AF. If you ever need a dose of no fluff related nonprofit content, definitely your place to look. And then I think there was another link you gave, the conspiracy one. Here you go, Cheyenne. This one is just for you. All right.
All right, so we have one more question, which is there one thing you'll do differently now that you know a bit more about community-centric fundraising?
That's a great question. You need to marinate on that. Do you know what to do?
I think I'll just be more open with my organization about what we should be expecting from our donors and that we can hold our donors to higher expectations. I mean, they're in theory smart people and capable people. So, if we just have very frank conversations with them and start building a more authentic relationship instead of this, you're so great, everything you do is amazing, then I think that we can start, changing our organization and, hopefully potentially other organizations will see an example and want to shift away from that donor-centric model as well. And I shared this with a development VP that I know at a former job. So I sent it to her and I was like, this made me think of you.
I love that. I think something I'll definitely take moving forward is how do I word it? Trying to find the thought that I legitimately just had. That interconnectedness. So I really liked the point in the podcast where they spoke about interconnectedness between other nonprofits serving the same or similar portions of the community, and really finding commonality and power behind conjoined purpose. And I think our Central Florida nonprofits could benefit from that viewpoint. I think a lot of us only interact during like fundraising events where we're sitting at the booth for our organization at another organization's fundraising event, or to like leverage networking, but never to share a donor profile, never to share a portfolio of like where money's coming from, because that, I think that still exists of we're in a space where we are fighting for dollars, when in reality there's enough wealth in this country to solve a lot of the inequity that we're facing. And when I say we're, I don't mean like you and me. I mean as a community that our community is facing. And that type of concept, I think I will continue to take with me moving forward and pushing for communal fundraising organizing. I think that that's powerful when you see community nonprofits building up and boasting up each other. And Cheyenne said, I'm going to chat with my development team to see what they're doing. And I think, honestly, that's probably the best, most realistic place to start. If you're not currently in development, turn to someone in development and say, like, hey, what do we like do to show appreciation to donors? Fun question. What do we do to get a donor, to get like a potential cultivating donor to give that donation or give that grant or give that money? Like where are we centering our efforts? And who are we centering in those efforts? Mm-hmm. I think that's probably the most realistic place to start. Maybe the most uncomfortable, depending on how much experience you have speaking with your development team in your organization.
Yeah, no, that's a great way to start. And I think most people who are working at nonprofits, it's feasible. Like they can actually go and do that tomorrow. So, all right. Well, any other comments or questions in the chat?
I don't think there are. I think we've thrown up most of them along the way. All
right. Well, thank you guys for joining me. I really love doing these podcast programs with you guys. Oh my gosh, I can't believe it's already like 11 months into the year. It's pretty insane. But I really appreciate you guys joining me. And thank you, Meg, for hopping on too. And then also just one more plug to apply to join the YNPN board. You get to plan fun things like this, or you can work in development or marketing. So if there's an area that you have experience or you want experience, there's something for anybody who wants to dip their toes into some leadership within nonprofit world. So really highly encourage you to apply. It's been a great experience.
Absolutely. That comment is pinned in the comments of this stream. And like Erin mentioned, they are open until the 22nd. So if the work week is not the time for you to start that process, please take the weekend to do so. It's a few quick demographic questions and then submitting an updated resume. Really nothing too heavy. And Erin and I are 10 out of 10 definitely biased, but we'll definitely speak positively about the experience and the shifting of YNPN to the future. There's only bigger, more exciting, more candid conversations to come. So thank you for joining us. Bye-bye to Pints Podcasts for the year.
Bye, everyone.